What if I told you that some of the most dangerous stage 4 colon cancer cells survive on the exact same biological pathways that many modern diets activate every single day? And what's even more surprising is this: long before a tumor becomes visible on a scan, the environment inside the body is already changing. Chronic inflammation begins damaging the lining of the colon. Blood sugar spikes repeatedly. Insulin stays elevated. Harmful gut bacteria start producing toxic compounds. The immune system becomes exhausted. And little by little, the body creates conditions where abnormal cells can grow, spread, and protect themselves. Here's what's really going on inside your body. Cancer is not just a random event. Colon cancer, in particular, is deeply connected to metabolism, inflammation, immune health, and the microbiome, the trillions of bacteria living inside your gut. Stage 4 cancer cells are incredibly adaptive. They steal glucose aggressively. They manipulate blood vessels to feed themselves. They even create inflammatory signals that weaken the body's natural defenses. But modern research is revealing something incredibly important. When you change the terrain inside the body, you can make it far more difficult for cancer cells to survive and spread. Now, to be very clear, this is not about claiming that any single food cures cancer. That would be irresponsible and scientifically inaccurate. Cancer treatment should always involve qualified medical professionals. But what the research does show is that nutrition, fasting patterns, sleep quality, physical activity, gut health, and anti-angiogenic foods can strongly influence the biological environment cancer depends on. And this is where the conversation becomes incredibly empowering. Because many people think cancer prevention is purely genetic. They believe if it runs in the family, there's nothing they can do. But science tells a very different story. Studies from institutions like Harvard University and MD Anderson Cancer Center continue showing that lifestyle and metabolic health play a major role in colon cancer risk, progression, inflammation, and survival outcomes. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Imagine your body as a garden. Healthy cells are like strong, organized plants growing in healthy soil. But cancer cells behave more like invasive weeds. And what determines whether weeds spread aggressively? The condition of the soil, the amount of water, the nutrients available, the surrounding environment. Cancer cells thrive in metabolic chaos, high insulin, chronic inflammation, poor gut diversity, constant overeating, sleep deprivation, sedentary living. These conditions fertilize the soil. But when you improve metabolic flexibility, reduce inflammatory signaling, support your immune system, and feed the beneficial bacteria inside your colon, you begin changing the terrain itself. And that's exactly what we're going to explore today. We'll break down the hidden metabolic pathways colon cancer depends on. Why? The surprising connection between sugar, insulin, and tumor growth. Why your gut microbiome may be one of the strongest anti-cancer systems in your body. How certain foods naturally disrupt blood vessel growth that tumors rely on. And the daily habits that research now links to dramatically lower colon cancer risk. Because the goal is not fear. The goal is understanding. And once you understand how the body works, you can begin making decisions that support healing, resilience, energy, longevity, and protection at the deepest cellular level. And if this kind of science-based, practical health content is helpful so far, consider subscribing because every day we break down complex health research into tools you can actually use in real life. Here's what's really going on inside your body. One of the most misunderstood ideas in cancer biology is the belief that cancer is purely a genetic bad luck event. But when you look closely at colon cancer through the lens of metabolism, a different picture emerges, one that is far more connected to daily fuel availability than most people realize. Cancer cells, especially aggressive ones, have a unique metabolic behavior. Many of them rely heavily on glucose as their primary fuel source, even when oxygen is present. This is known in medical science as the Warburg effect. Instead of efficiently producing energy like healthy cells do through mitochondria, cancer cells shift toward rapid glucose fermentation. It's less efficient, but extremely fast, and that speed supports uncontrolled growth. Now here's the critical point. Glucose is not the problem. Your body needs it. Your brain depends on it. But chronically elevated glucose and insulin levels create a biochemical environment that can favor rapid cell proliferation, including abnormal cells. Let me explain this with a simple analogy. Imagine your bloodstream is a highway. In a healthy metabolic state, traffic flows smoothly. Energy moves in and out of cells in a controlled rhythm. But when you constantly consume refined carbohydrates, sugary drinks, and ultra-processed foods, it's like turning that highway into rush hour congestion every single day. Insulin keeps rising to manage the traffic. Over time, some cells begin adapting to this constant fuel abundance signal. Cancer cells, if they are present, exploit that environment. What the research shows is that metabolic disorders like insulin resistance, obesity, and chronic hyperglycemia are associated with higher risk and poorer outcomes in colon cancer. Large observational studies and clinical data reviewed by institutions such as Harvard University and cancer research centers like MD Anderson Cancer Center consistently highlight the role of metabolic health as a key driver of cancer progression risk. Not just genetics alone. Here's the deeper mechanism most people miss. Insulin is not just a blood sugar hormone. It is also a growth signaling hormone. When insulin is chronically elevated, it can activate pathways like IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor. You see, which are involved in cell growth and division. In normal physiology, this is essential for healing. But in a constantly activated state, it may unintentionally support abnormal cellular growth environments. Now, this does not mean sugar feeds cancer directly in a simple one-to-one way, as social media often oversimplifies. The reality is more nuanced. Cancer cells will use whatever fuel is available. But metabolic imbalance changes the ecosystem, and that ecosystem can influence how aggressively abnormal cells behave. So, what can you actually do with this information? The goal is not elimination of carbohydrates. The goal is metabolic stability. One of the most effective strategies supported by metabolic research is reducing constant glucose spikes. This means shifting from frequent eating to structured eating windows, prioritizing whole foods over refined carbohydrates, and pairing carbohydrates with fiber, protein, and healthy fats to slow glucose absorption. For example, instead of a refined breakfast that spikes blood sugar quickly, a meal containing eggs, olive oil, vegetables, and seeds creates a slower, more stable insulin response. That stability reduces unnecessary growth signaling pressure inside the body. Another powerful lever is improving insulin sensitivity through movement. Even a 10-15 minute walk after meals can significantly reduce post-meal glucose spikes. This is one of the simplest but most underused metabolic tools available. And here's the key idea to remember. You're not trying to starve cancer in a literal sense. You are trying to remove the metabolic conditions that make rapid, abnormal cell growth easier to sustain. When you stabilize blood sugar, improve insulin sensitivity, and reduce metabolic stress, you shift the internal environment away from growth signaling chaos and toward repair and balance. That is the real foundation of prevention, not fear, but physiology. Let's go one layer deeper, because even if metabolism is the fuel system of the body, inflammation is the fire alarm system that never turns off in many modern lifestyles. Here's what's really going on inside your body. Inflammation is meant to protect you. When you cut yourself or get an infection, immune cells rush in, chemicals are released, and the area becomes inflamed temporarily. That's acute inflammation, short, controlled, and essential for healing. But colon cancer is strongly linked to something very different, chronic low-grade inflammation. Think of it like this. Instead of a fire alarm going off once when there's danger, it starts beeping all day, every day, even when there is no real fire. Eventually, the system becomes exhausted, desensitized, and less effective at responding to real threats. In the colon, this constant inflammatory noise slowly damages the intestinal lining, disrupts immune surveillance, and alters the gut environment in ways that may allow abnormal cells to survive longer than they should. One of the biggest drivers of this is the modern diet and lifestyle pattern. Highly processed foods, excess refined oils, low fiber intake, chronic stress, poor sleep, and physical inactivity all contribute to elevated inflammatory markers in the body. These include cytokines like IL-6 and TNF-alpha. Chemical messengers that, when chronically elevated, can interfere with normal tissue repair and immune function. Now let's connect this directly to colon health. The colon is constantly exposed to everything you eat. It's also home to trillions of bacteria interacting with the immune system every second. When inflammation becomes chronic, the protective barrier of the colon, known as the mucosal lining, can become weakened. This increases something called intestinal permeability, often described as leaky gut in functional medicine. When that barrier is compromised, harmful bacterial metabolites and inflammatory compounds can interact more directly with immune cells in the colon wall. Over time, this creates an environment where DNA damage and abnormal cell signaling become more likely. Large-scale research in gastrointestinal oncology has consistently observed that conditions involving chronic intestinal inflammation, such as inflammatory bowel diseases, are associated with higher colon cancer risk. While most people don't have these diseases, the underlying principle matters. Inflammation is not just a symptom. It is part of the disease environment itself. Now, here's where things become empowering instead of overwhelming. Because inflammation is highly responsive to daily behavior. Let's break this into practical tools. First, food quality matters more than almost anything else here. Diets rich in fiber, polyphenols, and omega-3 fats help reduce inflammatory signaling. Plant compounds found in foods like berries, leafy greens, turmeric, garlic, and green tea interact with inflammatory pathways at the cellular level. Second, gut bacteria play a major role in controlling inflammation. Beneficial microbes produce short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, which help calm immune activity in the colon and support the integrity of the gut lining. But these bacteria only thrive when they are consistently fed with diverse plant fibers. Third, body fat itself is metabolically active. Especially visceral fat, the fat around internal organs, releases inflammatory signals even when you are not eating. This is one of the reasons metabolic health and inflammation are so tightly connected. And finally, sleep is not just rest. It is immune regulation. Poor sleep has been shown in multiple studies to increase inflammatory markers the very next day. That means your colon environment is partially shaped by how well you sleep at night. So what does this mean in practical terms? It means reducing inflammation is not about one supplement or one superfood. It's about reducing the total inflammatory load on the body. Eat more whole, fiber-rich plant foods. Reduce ultra-processed and refined foods. Support gut bacteria diversity. Improve sleep consistency. Move your body daily. Reduce chronic stress activation. Even small changes in these areas begin to shift inflammatory signaling within weeks. And this is the key idea to carry forward. Cancer does not grow in isolation. It grows in an environment. And when you change the environment, when you lower inflammation, stabilize metabolism, and support immune function, you fundamentally change how hospitable that environment is to disease. Here's what's really going on inside your body. Inside your colon, there is an ecosystem more complex than almost any other system in your body. The gut microbiome. Trillions of bacteria, fungi, and microorganisms are living there right now, actively influencing digestion, immunity, inflammation, and even gene expression. And here's the part most people don't realize. Your microbiome is not just passively sitting there. It is constantly talking to your immune system. Think of it like an internal control center. Some microbes send signals that calm inflammation, repair the gut lining, and strengthen immune surveillance. Others can produce metabolites that irritate the intestinal wall and increase oxidative stress. So when we talk about colon cancer risk, we are also talking about the balance of this ecosystem. Here's what's really going on inside your body. One of the most protective compounds produced by beneficial gut bacteria is butyrate. A short-chain fatty acid created when bacteria ferment dietary fiber. Butyrate is especially important because it serves two critical roles. First, it is a primary fuel source for the cells lining your colon. That means it literally nourishes and strengthens the intestinal barrier. Second, it has powerful anti-inflammatory effects and has been studied for its role in regulating cell growth and supporting normal cell death processes, apoptosis, which is essential for removing damaged cells before they become problematic. Now let's connect this to colon cancer biology. When fiber intake is low, which is extremely common in modern diets, butyrate production drops. That means the colon lining becomes less supported, inflammation can rise, and the protective mechanisms inside the gut weaken over time. On the other hand, when fiber intake is high and diverse, beneficial bacteria flourish. This creates a biochemical environment that supports balance rather than dysfunction. Research in nutritional oncology, including work from institutions like Harvard University and large microbiome studies, has repeatedly shown strong associations between high fiber diets, improved microbial diversity, and lower risk of colorectal cancer development. Now, let me simplify this with a visual analogy. Imagine your colon as a garden soil system. Beneficial bacteria are like the healthy microorganisms that enrich the soil, helping plants grow strong and resilient. Harmful bacteria are like weeds that release toxins into the soil and compete for nutrients. If you feed the soil poorly, low fiber, high processed food, the weeds start taking over. The soil becomes acidic, damaged, and less able to support healthy growth. But if you feed the soil properly, diverse fibers from vegetables, legumes, fruits, seeds, and whole grains, the beneficial bacteria dominate. They produce protective compounds, strengthen the soil structure, and suppress harmful microbial overgrowth. Now, here's where things get even more interesting. Your immune system lives in close proximity to this ecosystem. In fact, a large portion of immune cells are located in the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. That means microbial balance directly influences immune surveillance, the body's ability to detect and remove abnormal cells early. When the microbiome is balanced, immune cells are more alert and efficient. When the microbiome is disrupted, immune signaling becomes confused or suppressed. So what can you actually do to support this system? First, increase fiber diversity, not just fiber quantity. Different bacteria feed on different types of fibers. This is why eating a wide range of plant foods is more effective than relying on a single superfood. Urosari, or sucrose. Second, include resistant starches, foods like cooked and cooled potatoes, green bananas, oats, and legumes. These specifically feed butyrate-producing bacteria. Third, fermented foods such as yogurt, kefir, sauerkraut, and kimchi introduce beneficial microbial diversity that can help rebalance the gut environment. Fourth, reduce unnecessary disruption. Frequent antibiotics without need, ultra-processed diets, and chronic alcohol intake can significantly reduce microbial diversity over time. And finally, consistency matters more than perfection. The microbiome responds to patterns over weeks and months, not single meals. So the key takeaway is this. Your gut is not just a digestive organ. It is a metabolic, immune, and anti-inflammatory control system that directly influences colon health at the cellular level. When you feed it correctly, you are not just improving digestion, you're actively shaping the biological environment that determines whether inflammation rises or falls, whether immune surveillance stays strong or weak, and whether abnormal cells are more or less likely to thrive. Here's what's really going on inside your body. Once a group of abnormal cells begins to grow, the body faces a critical biological checkpoint: oxygen and nutrient supply. No tissue, including tumors, can grow beyond a very small size without building its own blood supply. This process is called angiogenesis, the formation of new blood vessels. And this is where colon cancer becomes especially aggressive in advanced stages. Tumors don't just grow, they actively manipulate the body. They release chemical signals that essentially tell nearby blood vessels, grow toward me, feed me, support me. Once that vascular network forms, the tumor is no longer isolated. It becomes integrated into the body's circulation system, which allows it to expand and, in some cases, spread. Now let me explain this with a simple analogy. Imagine a city that starts illegally expanding at night. At first, it's just a small cluster of buildings, but then it secretly builds roads to connect itself to the main highway system. Once those roads are established, resources can flow in freely. Food, materials, energy. The city grows faster and becomes harder to control. That is essentially what angiogenesis does for a tumor. But here's the important scientific insight. Angiogenesis is not an all-or-nothing switch. It is regulated by a balance between pro-growth signals and anti-growth signals in the body. And this is where nutrition and lifestyle become surprisingly relevant. Here's what's really going on inside your body. Your body naturally produces both growth-promoting and growth-regulating signals all the time. Certain conditions, like chronic inflammation, excess insulin signaling, and oxidative stress, tend to tilt the balance toward more vascular growth activity. On the other hand, some dietary compounds have been shown in experimental and clinical research to influence these signaling pathways in the opposite direction. This does not mean food replaces medical treatment, but it does mean the internal environment can be influenced. For example, compounds found in foods like green tea, EGCG, turmeric, curcumin, tomatoes, lycopene, garlic, organosulfur compounds, berries, polyphenols, and extra virgin olive oil have been studied for their ability to interact with inflammation and angiogenesis-related signaling pathways in laboratory and observational studies. Research reviewed by institutions such as MD Anderson Cancer Center has highlighted how certain bioactive food compounds may influence tumor microenvironments by modulating inflammation and blood vessel signaling. Now let's make this practical and grounded. Think of angiogenesis like plumbing. If a tumor is a growing structure, angiogenesis is the plumbing system that supplies it with water, nutrients, and oxygen. The more efficient the plumbing becomes, the faster the structure can expand. So the goal from a prevention perspective is not to shut down blood flow. That would be dangerous and impossible, but to maintain a healthy balance of signaling inside the body so that abnormal, uncontrolled growth is less likely to be supported. Now, here are the most important real-world levers that actually matter. First, chronic inflammation is one of the strongest drivers of pro-angiogenic signaling. That's why everything we discussed earlier, gut health, metabolic balance, insulin control, directly connects here. Second, excess body fat, especially visceral fat, acts like an endocrine organ. It releases inflammatory cytokines that can influence vascular growth pathways. Third, oxygenation and movement matter. Regular physical activity improves circulation, reduces inflammation, and supports healthy vascular function throughout the body. And fourth, diet quality matters in a cumulative way. It is not about one anti-cancer food, but rather the long-term pattern of consuming foods rich in plant compounds that support metabolic balance and reduce inflammatory stress. Let's simplify the takeaway. Cancer growth is not just about abnormal cells multiplying. It is also about whether the body allows those cells to build infrastructure. And that infrastructure, blood supply, is heavily influenced by the internal metabolic and inflammatory environment. So, when you improve insulin sensitivity, reduce chronic inflammation, support gut health, and increase phytonutrient diversity, you are not just improving general health. You're, sir, why? You are changing the biological permissions inside the body that determine how easily abnormal growth can be supported. Here's what's really going on inside your body. Every cell in your body is constantly making a decision how to generate energy. This sounds simple, but it's actually one of the most important determinants of long-term health and disease resistance. Healthy cells are metabolically flexible. They can efficiently switch between glucose and fat-derived fuel, ketones, depending on availability. This flexibility allows them to survive periods of low food intake, repair damage, and maintain stable function. Cancer cells, however, often lose this flexibility. Instead, many cancer cells become heavily dependent on glucose and exhibit what scientists call metabolic inflexibility. They prioritize rapid energy production through glycolysis, even when oxygen is present, because it supports fast growth. Now let me explain this with a simple analogy. Think of healthy cells like hybrid cars. They can run on electricity or fuel depending on conditions. They adapt smoothly. Cancer cells, in many cases, behave more like engines that only run on one type of fuel, gasoline. If that fuel is abundant, they thrive. If fuel availability becomes unstable, they face stress. This is where metabolic interventions like fasting and time-restricted eating enter the discussion. Here's what's really going on inside your body. When you extend the period between meals, or for example, through time-restricted eating, insulin levels naturally drop for longer periods. This allows the body to shift toward fat oxidation and ketone production. This metabolic state is often referred to as nutritional ketosis. During this shift, several important physiological changes occur. Insulin signaling decreases. Inflammation markers can reduce. Cellular cleanup processes like autophagy become more active. Mitochondria operate under different energy conditions. Autophagy, in particular, is like a cellular recycling system. Damaged proteins and dysfunctional cellular components are broken down and reused. This process is essential for maintaining cellular health and preventing the accumulation of damage over time. Now, research in metabolic health suggests that normal cells tend to adapt relatively well to these fuel shifts because of their flexibility. Cancer cells, on the other hand, may be more metabolically stressed in low glucose, low insulin environments, though it is critical to understand that this is an area of ongoing research and varies widely depending on cancer type and stage. This is why institutions studying cancer metabolism, including MD Anderson Cancer Center, have increasingly focused on the relationship between metabolic state, insulin signaling, and tumor biology. But let's be very clear and responsible here. Fasting is not a treatment for cancer. It is not a substitute for medical care. And it should never be applied during active cancer treatment without strict medical supervision, especially in individuals at risk of malnutrition or undergoing chemotherapy. What we are discussing is physiology, how the body responds to fuel availability. Now let's make this practical. If someone wants to improve metabolic flexibility safely, here are the evidence-informed approaches. First, start with time-restricted eating. For many people, a 10-12 hour eating window, for example 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., is more sustainable than extreme fasting and still allows the body overnight metabolic switching. Second, avoid constant snacking. Every eating event raises insulin. Reducing meal frequency gives the body time to return to baseline metabolic state. Third, prioritize nutrient-dense meals. When you do eat, focus on protein, fiber, healthy fats, and phytonutrient-rich plants. This reduces glucose spikes and supports metabolic stability. Fourth, support circadian rhythm. Eating earlier in the day aligns better with insulin sensitivity patterns. Studies show that late-night eating can disrupt glucose regulation and metabolic balance. Fifth, combine fasting patterns with lifestyle movement, especially walking after meals and light resistance training, which improves glucose uptake and insulin sensitivity. Now step back and connect the full picture. Metabolic flexibility is not just about fat loss or energy levels. It is about how adaptable your internal environment is. When your body can efficiently switch between fuel sources, regulate insulin, control inflammation, and activate repair pathways, you create a system that is more stable and resilient at the cellular level. And when that system becomes rigid, constantly high insulin, constant glucose availability, chronic inflammation, the internal environment becomes more permissive to disease processes. So the key takeaway is this. You are not just managing calories. You are managing cellular signals. And those signals determine whether your body is in a state of constant growth pressure or balanced repair. In the final section, we'll bring everything together into a simple daily framework. So you can apply these principles in a realistic, sustainable way that supports long-term metabolic health, colon protection, energy, and longevity. When you zoom out from all the mechanisms we've discussed, one side, insulin signaling, inflammation, microbiome balance, angiogenesis, and metabolic flexibility, a single unifying principle emerges. Cancer does not develop in a vacuum. It develops in a biological environment. And that environment is shaped every single day by your choices. Now, let's bring all of this together into a simple, practical framework. Not as a perfect protocol, but as a realistic way to support your body's natural defenses and metabolic stability over time. When these three systems are balanced, the internal environment supports repair, immune surveillance, and microbial diversity,